The year is 2025. The world is watching Eastern Europe with bated breath, as the conflict that has gripped the region for years enters a new and dangerous phase. The air is thick with uncertainty, and the streets of cities like Kursk and Donetsk are eerily quiet in the early morning light, as if holding their breath for what comes next. After months of brutal, relentless fighting, Russian forces finally managed to recapture the strategically vital city of Kursk. The battle for Kursk was not just another skirmish. It was a turning point, a symbol of both Russian determination and the staggering cost of this war. The city itself bore the scars of conflict: shattered buildings, burned-out vehicles, and streets littered with the remnants of battle. Soldiers, weary and battered, patrolled the ruins, their faces etched with exhaustion and loss. The Russian flag once again flew over Kursk, but the victory was bittersweet. This victory, however, came at a heavy price. Putin's forces were not only depleted in numbers, but also in spirit. The cost in lives and equipment was staggering, and the sense of triumph was overshadowed by fatigue and uncertainty about what lay ahead. Yet despite these losses, the Kremlin was determined to press on, to maintain the offensive in the Donbas region, a region that had become the focal point of the conflict. Putin's plan was simple, at least on paper. He would move approximately 62,000 troops from Kursk, through the bordering Belgorod region, and then south towards the Donbas. The idea was to reinforce Russian positions in the east. This plan, though, relied on a critical assumption that Ukraine was spent, its forces exhausted and incapable of mounting any serious counteroffensives. Russian intelligence suggested that Ukrainian units in the Donbas were low on ammunition and morale, and that the recent battles had left them too weak to resist a renewed Russian push. In Kremlin war rooms, commanders discussed their strategy with confidence, convinced that the time was right to strike hard and fast. It was, as it turned out, a fatal miscalculation. Ukrainian forces, far from broken, had been quietly regrouping and preparing for just such a move. As Russian convoys advanced, they were met with fierce resistance and sudden, coordinated counterattacks. Explosions rocked the columns, and chaos erupted as Ukrainian troops struck with precision and determination. The battle for the Donbas was far from over, and for Putin, the cost of underestimating his enemy would soon become painfully clear. In late March of 2025, the world watched as Ukrainian forces took a bold and unprecedented step. For the first time since the full-scale invasion began, Ukrainian troops crossed into Russian territory, launching a series of surprise attacks that would soon capture global attention. Their target? The Belgorod region, a vital area just across the border, long considered a safe haven for Russian military logistics and command. The operation was shrouded in secrecy, with only a handful of top Ukrainian commanders aware of the full scope of the plan. As dawn broke, columns of Ukrainian vehicles moved swiftly and quietly, their mission clear but dangerous. At first, these were small-scale raids, designed to test Russian defenses and probe for weaknesses along the border. Ukrainian patrols slipped through dense forests and across open fields, gathering intelligence and mapping out enemy positions. These early incursions were quick and surgical, often lasting only a few hours before the units melted back into the landscape. Russian border guards, caught off guard, scrambled to respond, but the Ukrainians always seemed one step ahead, vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. The raids sent a clear message: nowhere was truly safe, and Ukraine was willing to take the fight beyond its own borders. Then, on April 21st, everything changed. Ukraine launched a major offensive, escalating the conflict to a new and dangerous level. In the early morning hours, a massive convoy of armored vehicles surged forward, supported by coordinated artillery strikes and drone attacks. Explosions rocked rural Russian towns as Ukrainian forces pushed deeper into Belgorod, targeting key infrastructure and military outposts. The scale and speed of the assault stunned Russian commanders and sent shockwaves through Moscow's political and military leadership. For the first time, the war had truly come home to Russia. Ukraine's strategy was bold and decisive. Rather than simply defending their own territory, Ukrainian leaders chose to strike at the heart of Russia's supply network. In war rooms filled with digital maps and live drone feeds, officers coordinated complex maneuvers, directing units to key targets and adapting to Russian counterattacks. Soldiers prepared advanced weaponry, knowing that success here could change the course of the entire conflict. The mood among Ukrainian troops was one of determination and resolve. They understood the risks, but also the potential rewards. They understood that the Belgorod region was a critical artery for Russia's war machine, really the lifeline for their troops in the Donbas. Belgorod's railways and highways served as the main supply routes for ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements flowing to Russian units fighting in eastern Ukraine. The Belgorod offensive showcased a new level of sophistication in Ukraine's military capabilities. For the first time, Ukrainian F-16 fighter jets, armed with American-made JDAM, or Joint Direct Attack Munition bombs, roared into action over Russian soil. These were not the same Ukrainian forces that Russia had encountered a year earlier. The F-16s, with their advanced targeting systems and long-range strike capabilities, allowed Ukraine to strike deep behind enemy lines with pinpoint accuracy. Russian troop concentrations, ammunition depots, command centers, no target was safe. The terrain of Belgorod presented both challenges and opportunities for Ukraine. Unlike the dense forests and rolling hills of Kursk, Belgorod is characterized by open plains, which are ideal for rapid troop movements and flanking maneuvers. Ukraine exploited this to their advantage. They targeted key bridges and roads, channeling Russian reinforcements into predictable routes that were, honestly, pretty easy to ambush. Ukrainian supply lines, running southeast from the Sumy region, were largely concealed by dense woodland, making them difficult for Russian forces to detect and target. Years of unchecked corruption, mismanagement, and the relentless pressure of international sanctions had taken a heavy toll on the Russian military machine. Funds meant for maintenance and modernization often disappeared into the pockets of corrupt officials, leaving soldiers with outdated and poorly maintained equipment. The impact of these issues was now impossible to ignore. Much of the equipment in use was decades old, relics from the Soviet era that had seen better days. Tanks and armored vehicles frequently broke down and spare parts were in short supply. The lack of modern technology put Russian troops at a disadvantage, especially when facing opponents with more advanced weaponry and better logistical support. This slow response to evolving battlefield conditions left Russian units vulnerable and often unable to respond effectively to new threats. To make matters worse, many of the Russian troops stationed in Belgorod were young conscripts, hastily mobilized and lacking the training and experience of their professional counterparts. These inexperienced soldiers were thrust into high-pressure situations with minimal preparation, often unsure of their roles or the objectives they were meant to achieve. The result was a force plagued by low morale. Exhaustion, fear, and uncertainty were etched on the faces of many soldiers. Stories of hardship and disillusionment spread quickly through the ranks, further eroding the fighting spirit that had once defined the Russian military. The once mighty Russian bear, a symbol of strength and resilience, was now looking increasingly vulnerable. The world watched as the cracks widened, wondering just how much longer the Russian military could withstand the mounting pressures from within and without. The Belgorod offensive had significant geopolitical ramifications. The European Union, initially hesitant to provide Ukraine with offensive weaponry, now increased its military aid. However, the United States, President Trump, adopted a more isolationist stance. Trump's attempts to broker a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine were met with skepticism, particularly after Russia violated the terms of a temporary ceasefire. The situation in Belgorod was a political nightmare for Vladimir Putin. His special military operation was now in its third year, with no end in sight. The Russian economy was reeling from sanctions, and public support for the war was waning. On April 25th, just 4 days after the major Ukrainian offensive, Putin made a significant announcement. For the first time, he publicly expressed his willingness to engage in serious and unconditional ceasefire talks with Ukraine. The Belgorod offensive marked a potential turning point in the war in Ukraine. It demonstrated that Russia was not invincible and that Ukraine had the will and the means to fight back effectively. However, the road to peace remained long and uncertain. Previous attempts at ceasefires had failed, and trust between the two sides was practically non-existent. The outcome of any future negotiations would depend on a complex interplay of military realities, political calculations, and international pressure.